It's this week that the story of Joseph takes a turn. We come across a human tragedy, brothers who can't get along, eventually stop roughhousing, and they assault, kidnap, almost murder before they finally sell their young brother into slavery. And they do this all for about 2 coins of silver apiece. It is a series of events that seem senseless, cruel, and without purpose. Yet later in the story, we found out this act of betrayal will make the difference in keeping God's promise to Abraham and all his descendants. And though we do not see it at the time, we know that there must be some sort of plan behind this. What we do see are scenes that kind of at first appear to be disjointed. Our first is Joseph faithfully following his father's instructions to seek out his brothers who are keeping the sheep. They have moved on where he thought they were, and Joseph is wandering lost in a field. Now, even kind of the Old Testament professors, when I was kind of doing some research for this, said we don't know really why this part is actually in the story. It doesn't make much sense, but it kind of moves it along. And so we find that when we look at the scripture, since we have kind of this scene that nobody knows about or even kind of described or fleshed out, that we are able to kind of use our imagination when we are able to look at this passage. In fact, since there is no description of the man Joseph encounters, his age, his height, the sound of his voice, it also does not say that when this gentleman meets Joseph that he didn't take off his cardigan, he didn't begin to take off his shoes. But all this week, at least in my mind, I have been picturing Reverend Fred Rogers. You may know him as just Fred Rogers. For all the younger people, or at least young at heart, we know him as Mr. Rogers. And so if we use our imagination, boys and girls, we can see this actually happening. We have someone who takes time from his day. He is taking time to kind of help this young, lost kind of son of Jacob. Maybe he's helping him kind of process the emotions. We can hear Mr. Rogers' patient voice ask Joseph how he feels about failing his fathers. We can ask him, well, have you not been able to find your brothers? And of course, since we pictured this fellow as Mr. Rogers, we can imagine that he gives the young Joseph directions, probably in the form of a song. He was always giving advice in songs. Now, we might have also pictured Mr. Rogers because of several generations of children he was there to comfort, to explain, and also to empower us to process our way through life. And this started from kind of the very beginning. In 1968, the first year of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, it was still even in black and white back then. They addressed kind of a volatile year in political assassinations. It was kind of a landmark event because like children shows did not talk about kind of big issues. They were kind of mostly there to distract, but kind of the writers and Mr. Rogers decided since it was kind of a crazy summer in 1968 that they would address it in kind of a simple and profound way. And the way that he did it for the next 30 years was kind of make simple things, but also very deep and profound ways to kind of explain the world around. Explain it for not only the children that were watching, but for the parents or maybe the helpers who were with the children at that time. He did it for about 30 more years. In fact, about not 2 weeks after Fred Rogers retired, he was pulled back out of retirement, and they put him on the air, and this was right after kind of the September 11th attacks in 2001. In the wake of the attacks, he appeared on TV. But this time, instead of in kind of the cardigan and kind of the shoes, he was dressed in a suit and a tie. He wore his glasses. And while sitting at the piano, you could tell it was something a little bit different. Because soon we would discover that it was the Reverend Mr. Rogers speaking to us. Many folks don't know, but every Presbyterian is told, and I think as an ordained Presbyterian, I'm like required to tell everybody that Mr. Rogers was actually a Presbyterian minister. You know, he was trained at Pittsburgh Seminary, a Presbyterian seminary. He was ordained in 1963, and this is some 5 years before he really kind of found his kind of TV success. And so the Reverend Mr. Rogers was very Presbyterian that day because he broke out his Hebrew and told us we were all supposed to be Tikkun Olam, which means repairers of creation. He talked about that, and more importantly, it was fun, especially if you were kind of raised in the Presbyterian churches. You could see what he was describing and kind of talking with the people. He was encouraging all of those who were shocked, even encouraging kind of those shocked young ones. And he was weaving in the words of the Apostle Paul. He was saying that we should remember to share, that we should share our hope, our faith, pardon and joy, and to love our neighbors and also to love ourselves. Now, my generation kind of grew up with Mr. Rogers, and it helped in those chaotic days, especially if you were kind of on the East Coast like I was. If you had been spent the day kind of wondering where your friends in New York or in Washington, D.C. were, and it was still kind of one of those weird things that even in moments of chaos, in moments of traumatic events, that you could listen to words of wisdom. Now, a younger generation, they might kind of see the picture of Mr. Rogers as kind of this guy who gives great advice. In fact, some of this, his quintessential advice was to look for the helper. So it might be natural for us to kind of picture this man that helps Joseph on his way as a helper. And this is because in the last 15 years, and perhaps we've encountered this in social media, perhaps we've seen this on Facebook and TikTok, maybe in a reel or in something else, is you've seen kind of the picture or the image or maybe even a meme or kind of a quote of Mr. Rogers talking about looking for the helpers. Now, Mr. Rogers shared this advice. In fact, he shared that it was actually his mother's advice, that when he encountered kind of something that was horrible or maybe something that was scary on TV or in the movies, and then later as he grew up, he kind of applied it to kind of the real life when he encountered bad news. But he would always say, look for the helpers. Always focus on those who are helping. You know, when we see kind of wherever we get our news, whether we see it visually, you know, there's always kind of this great aspect of showing kind of the traumatic events. You know, there's always kind of the old phrase, if it bleeds, it leads. And so Mr. Rogers was telling us to look for the helpers. And this can be something that was in a man-made catastrophe. We see them in shootings or in wartime. We see these in kind of natural events, whether it is a wildfire. And a generation who kind of grew up not actually seeing the real Mr. Rogers still benefits from his example and his words of wisdom. And so perhaps in this scripture, we can recognize a helper as Joseph moves unwittingly into a family tragedy. Now, our second scene is an example of how things can escalate quickly. The brothers of Joseph were kind of simply sitting around, and they spot Joseph, and within seconds they have devised a plan to kill the boy and kind of end these dreams of dominance. You know, evidently those dreams were getting under their skin just a little bit too much, and so within seconds they know exactly what to do. And we have to be clear that this was actually a real threat. You know, the sons of Israel had actually killed their proposed brother-in-law just a few chapters before. The sons of Israel could have been almost a mafia family in some ways, except for kind of Joseph. He's kind of the one that dreams out there. You know, these guys were kind of rough, and they had kind of a history of violence, at least some of them. What follows, though, is a series of these brothers who have kind of taken this really bad idea of murdering Joseph and kind of negotiating out into less terrible but it still ends up as a horrible crime and a cover-up for years. It is a key part of Genesis. In fact, it was such a key part of Genesis, and I remember my Hebrew professor used this text as the kind of our final exam. And, this week I actually had it when I was kind of clearing out my office. I pulled out my old summer Hebrew final. It was over 20 years ago. And it's also, how in your mind, things change. I sat there and it's just like, I was pretty decent in Hebrew, had some fun times with Megan and Dave and Mike and my lifelong friend Ashley were all made there. And so I'm looking at the final, and that's when I realized it's just like, wow, my memory has changed. I barely passed by the skin of my teeth. That paper had so much red on it, it was like, it could have been a murder scene. But immediately, one of the memories I had is following the exam, because, it was seminary, so they kind of trusted us a little bit. And so you could take the final exam in the afternoon, or if you're an early riser, you could take it in the morning. And so, of course, back then, I wanted to get through Hebrew class as quick as possible, so I took it in the afternoon. And so me and my friend Dave, we came out, and it was like 4 or 5, it was getting close to kind of Frisbee team, because, some people are thankful for football, but in seminary, we're kind of thankful we play Frisbee, although it can still get a little bit dangerous as well. But we were getting ready, and we're going to go out there, we're going to kind of blow off some steam, and then we see our friend Mike Peacock. And so me and Dave were sitting there, and we were talking with him, and then my friend Dave, who's a little bit less scrupulous when it comes about giving hints about the final passage of an exam we just took, and he hasn't, suggested that maybe afterwards tonight that we go get Reuben sandwiches. And so Dave kind of elbows me a couple times, like, yes, Reuben sandwiches, and it's always best to have seconds if you're going to do that. And so, we were kind of, laying it on pretty thick with Mike there. My classmate Dave was like, he was kind of getting into more detail, like he was almost starting to do chapter and verse, when finally, our friend Mike Peacock, who in another life, he was Officer Peacock of the St. Petersburg Police Department. He was also kind of like the only man who also looked down on Dave Jones. Like Dave Jones was about like 6'2", but Mike Peacock was like 6'4", almost 6'5", or maybe he just seemed that big because his presence was commanding. In fact, the other part of his life is Mike Peacock was also Mike Peacock Esquire, a member of the Florida Bar and litigator. And it was always interesting due to his size and just kind of his commanding voice. Mike always seemed out of place. We had heard stories about when he went to law school, he had been a beat cop, and so all the other cops were kind of mad that he went out to law school. It's like, why are you going to get all these criminals that we got off the streets back on the streets? Likewise, as when he was in like the criminal law classes, and sometimes he'd be wearing kind of, his police workout gear or something, as his fellow colleagues would be sitting there and were pretty sure that he was there to represent the system, or even he said some of them were pretty sure he was in kind of the long sting operation or something like that. So he was a little bit always out of place. And he was a bit of out of place there. Mike was a second career seminary student. He was out of place with us 20-somethings, but he also brought some wisdom, and he told us that, I hear what you're saying, and I don't need any help. And then kind of he shifted the conversation, and it was kind of weird because he also told us a story about his son. And evidently he and his wife were kind of ahead of the curve, and they were kind of deciding that when they were going to be raising their kids, and especially their first son, is they were going to kind of go the all-natural route. And this was pretty exclusive of like food. Like he was saying that he and his wife, who was also a lawyer, and they were going to not give their kid anything that was processed. So everything that the child encountered was organic, homemade, and I'm probably guessing locally sourced. And this is back in like, the 70s and the 80s, a little bit ahead of his time. But one day, he was saying, it's like that all came to an end. One day he was walking in to pick up his kid from daycare. That was usually his kind of wife's job. He dropped the kid off in the morning. His wife picked the kid up in the afternoon. He was walking to pick up his kid, and he was even a little bit early. And so, they kind of hand the son to them, and you kind of notice there's this orange stuff on his son's face and hands. And for a while, he could not figure out what it was. He's kind of looking at his kid, and it's just like, what is going on here? And then kind of the daycare gal kind of goes out, she grabs some Kleenex, and she starts wiping the kid. And in the thickest kind of Florida Southern accent, which I cannot pull off, even though I do live on Florida Road now, they said that this kid just loved his cheese puffs. And to add that is Mike also discovered that his favorite drink was Dr. Pepper. It is still the South. And Mike must have been shocked. Every weekday morning for years, he had dropped off his son. He had had kind of the special lunch. He had also brought like the apple slices for his snacks. And it turns out in the afternoon that this kid had been cheating on his diet, or rather polluting, I guess. But Mike said after that, he and his wife kind of relaxed, lightened up. They had kind of a conversation that's like, yes, this is difficult for both of us. And so they kind of figured out different ways to take care of their kid. And they decided that, they would keep him at the same daycare place. They seemed to like it. Everything was going well. And then kind of Mike, shut his lawyer briefcase. He packed up his Hebrew kind of worksheets, and then we walked kind of out of the main building there. We decided to grab a snack, and then Dave and I went to go play some Frisbee because we had kind of all that pent up energy. After Frisbee, when like Dave and I are just covered in sweat, he said, "John, why the heck did Mike just tell us that story?" And I said, "Dave, he just told us that he's still going to be with us, even though we're bending the rules a little bit. But more importantly, Dave, is he's not going to rat us out to the dean." And Dave looked at me a little bit shocked. I'm like, "Dave, this is still a graduate school. It's like they can kick us out for like helping other people on their tests." Needless to say, I feel Dave benefited a lot from our ethics class. But he did have other gifts, which he shares pastoring a church in Georgia. Mike took a little bit longer, kind of took a little bit of a detour, but he eventually got ordained and pastored in his native Florida. But looking at our text, Reuben may have thought by throwing Joseph down the well or into a pit, he could commit kind of this lesser sin. Murder is pretty final, but stranding, or kind of, putting the annoying younger brother in timeout for a while, that's something you could kind of laugh off later. Their old father Jacob could probably even be convinced to forgive them if there was no harm, no foul. But the other brothers, led by Judah, found a way to actually kind of get rid of Joseph and not have blood on their hands. And so they end up selling Joseph into slavery. And then they must lie, they must keep that lie for years, and they had to cover up their crime. Now, our third and final scene is one that is poignant. We find the brothers bringing Joseph's iconic coat of many colors, his ornamental cloak, his technicolor dream coat. In the time, they see it is covered with blood. The brothers got kind of their story straight. They convinced Jacob that it was a wild beast who had killed his son. And it was Jacob who had sent his son alone into the wilderness. And so he grieves because this was his first son to perish. And the text says his favorite son, the first son of his beloved departed Rachel. And so even through the scripture today, you can kind of see his heart break. Now, a father's pain has some staying power. A few years ago, I was actually here in Durango for elder training. It was kind of in January. I won't say how many years, but it was a little while ago. And that morning, I came with a lone elder. a man who had been elder several times, so I was a little bit confused. It's like, all right, I guess I'm driving you to elder training, and so I was driving out there. And this guy was kind of the strong, silent type. He was also one of those guys you kind of heard stories about. But the most like I ever got kind of out of him before that day was he kind of mentioned vaguely that his grandma had come to Colorado in a covered wagon in the 1910s. You know, that's about as much as the personal stuff he would kind of let out. But I had heard in his youth he had been an amazing wrestler. He had been in the army during Vietnam. He was somebody that, like, when you were around other people, especially some old-timers, they kind of respected him, and, you know, people kind of quiet up, and, like, maybe if this person actually said something, they would pay attention, but he usually didn't say anything. But when we were coming back from Durango, I noticed that his phone was kind of blowing up. And it had really been doing this all day, the drive there, during kind of our round tables. And now as we passed the toxic waste site, which was that old Sinclair station on 160. Maybe some of you remember that. And I figured since that was a big enough distraction anyways, that I would just ask him, it's like, what's with the phone? And he paused for a moment and then said, today is my son's birthday. If he had lived, he would have been just a few years older than you. He said, I don't like to be alone on this day, so I figured elder training would be a good choice. After we got to Cortez, we ended up talking in the parking lot till he had a text from his wife, and then he went home. Now, unfortunately, this elder story is not as uncommon as we would hope. For whatever reason, at least the time that I've been in western Colorado, I've noticed that we have kind of a few more than the national average of grieving fathers. Fathers whose sons have passed in accidents, who passed by their own hand, or in conflict. And especially this week, we're kind of remembering 9/11, or maybe we did it partially last week when we were kind of sitting at our Labor Day barbecue and you noticed maybe a seat that was empty that should have been filled. We might be sensitive to those who grieve. It might be a good time to linger a little longer to talk. And the gift we can give is always kind of an empathetic ear, or kind of listen if somebody wants to tell a story. It is also kind of a good time to realize that sometimes events in the past can still have lasting effects. There's people living with bad decisions. Maybe there's people that are living with a little bit of envy or jealousy. Maybe there are people who are a little bit kind of nervous to give up a hatred or an anger. But it's always kind of a good time this time of year to be open to what people have to say. Now we can imagine how hard it was for Jacob. How difficult it was for the 10 brothers to kind of bear the weight of their sin and betrayal, and living almost day to day with a father who grieved the loss of a child. And we also have to admit this part of the story of Joseph is a downer, you know? And that's part of kind of the story that is sometimes difficult to deal with. But it's also one of those things we can relate to. We can understand a parent's love. We can understand how hard it is to stop a bad thing when it is put into motion, and how we can also run into everyday people trying their hardest. Now, thankfully, the story of Joseph does not end here. In many ways, this is actually the beginning of the adult Joseph story. And we will see it'll have its ups and its downs for many chapters and just a few weeks. But this week, as we leave here, we may cherish a relationship with love at its center. Perhaps we can be a little forgiving to our siblings and neighbors. Maybe we can look for helpers. And as Christ's disciples, may we be of help in a world that God loves. The Spirit has sent us out to embody that love. Perhaps we can be helpers for others. Would you please join me in a moment of silence?